Welcome to Secrets of a Murder Detective.
The murder of John Joe Hyton in August 2014 was one of Preston's most savage cases. I'm meeting with a senior investigating officer on the case to understand what really happened, the pressures, the setbacks, and the techniques they used to eventually bring the killers to justice.
My name's Edward Thistlethwaite. I was a detective superintendent in Lancashire Constabulary, and I served them for 30 years. This case was the pinnacle of my 30-year career. The savagery of this attack. I was absolutely determined to find out what had happened.
Eddie, thanks very much for coming in. It's very much a pleasure.
The case we're going to talk about today goes back to August 2014. What were you doing back then? What was your role?
I was detective superintendent in Lancashire Constabulary, and I was covering the Preston area, and was the on-duty detective superintendent for any serious crime or murders.
So, police were made aware of an incident and something came in.
Emergency Route Service.
What were you first told of the incident? What were you made aware of?
It was Saturday, 23rd of August, 2014. It was a bank holiday weekend. I was on call that night, and a detective inspector who works through the night contacted me and said a young boy had been murdered in St Stephen's Road at Preston.
What sort of time was it you got this call?
The call to the police was at 22 minutes past 11. I got a call within 5–10 minutes.
Oh, so pretty soon afterwards.
I'm on my way to that scene, 20 minutes, half an hour away. I'll be there about midnight.
It's really important if you're going to be a senior investigating officer on a murder to attend a scene, isn't it? You're going to get a feel for it that you wouldn't normally if you were looking at photographs, etc.
I don't think you can do that. You've got to go to the scene.
So when you get there, what was it you were confronted with?
It's a terrace street. They'd already put a cordon on. And I go to the ambulance and have a look, and I am confronted with the shock of the most horrific injuries I've probably ever seen in my 30 years. They named a young man as the deceased as John Joe Hyton. He's clearly got several stab wounds, and the worst of which was a very deep cut to the right side of his neck and face. No person would have survived such an injury.
Was there anybody at the scene that was telling you what had gone on?
We did house-to-house inquiries, but one key witness said John Joe was talking to us through the car window. John Joe had been in the pub having a drink. He decided, because he'd 50p left on the pool table, to have a final game of pool and just finish his pint, and walked home. This witness says he heard a screech and two cars razzed up from behind him and turned into St Stephen's Road. John Joe saw them, ran round the corner. 7 to 10 masked, balaclava men got out, pursued John Joe and caught him between two parked vehicles. Witnesses also told detectives that John Joe's last words were, "Let's talk, bro, let's talk." Sadly, they attacked and killed John Joe there and then, behaving like a pack of wolves. Unusually, John Joe's dad, so the victim's dad, lived 3 doors away, and somebody knocked on his door and come out, and it was identified by his father. So that's why we knew it was John Joe. Paramedics came and attended, but he was pronounced dead.
The next step would be preservation of a crime scene. And when you arrive there, essentially that's done, but your role would also be to assess, is this in the right place? Do I need to extend it in any way? Does another area have to be declared a crime scene?
Yeah, we extended the crime scene somewhat to where the vehicles approached from and where they left from. They left at speed and arrived at speed, so you're hoping for tyre marks, screed marks, things like that that might identify the vehicle. One of the big advantages was it was caught between two parked cars, so the scene would be 3 yards by 1.5 yards. And I felt and knew 4 or 5 people had been in that scene. You've got to be unlucky, haven't you, not to have 5 who have been caught, a DNA left. Carefully, with the crime scene manager, approached the curtilage of the area between the two parked cars. There was a pool of blood, exactly where he had laid between the two parked cars. Right next to that pool of blood was a broken samurai sword blade with red stains on it that I presumed was blood. It also hit me that This attack was so ferocious that a samurai sword blade had broken at the scene. Also, 1 metre away, underneath the back of the first car, there was a Dunlop golf club. It was broken, and it was 1 metre from where John Joe lay. 30-odd yards away was a drop lock knife. Next to it was a brick on the floor. The officer on the cordon then looked up and down the street. There were no other bricks. It was a tidy street. So we decided to bag that up and exhibit that and put it in the store. A very experienced detective approached me with details from the key witness. This witness is the person that said John Joe was talking to me in the car through the window. Then 2 cars came storming up behind us. He said the first car was a people carrier. He thought it was a Renault Scenic. The second car, the one directly in front of him, was definitely, he says, a Vauxhall Vectra, because he used to own a Vauxhall Vectra. He gave us 4 digits of the Vauxhall Vectra that he actually wrote down in dust on the windscreen. Kilo Golf Echo 4. The first car sped away. Before the second one sped away, a lad got into the rear passenger side door. Before that, he stood to our witness, looked him in the eye, looked the other person in the eye, looked down at the registered number plate and looked him back in the eye and nodded. And that witness is saying, I know you, I know this car. I thought that was hugely significant. What sort of person at such a time, when adrenaline must be pouring through your body, has the self-control to do that? I was very worried about that person.
What you've described is a really, really extremely violent incident. It's a fact, isn't it? It doesn't change where you are in the UK. The drugs trade is very highly profitable, and people are vying over those profits. And with that competition for the profits comes violence and extreme levels of violence.
The excessive force of this, your first reaction is perhaps this is gangs and this is drugs. And that was my first line of thought.
But as an investigator, you it's a bit of a cliche, but you have to keep an open mind, don't you? There's a saying in murder investigation, to understand how a person died, you have to understand how they lived. When you looked at John Joe's life, what sort of a picture were you building up of him?
Late teenager, 18, 19-year-old boy. Mum, lovely lady. Mum and dad not together, lovely people. Dad lived 3 doors down from where the attack happened. That appeared to be just coincidence. Mum brought up John Joe and his brother Byron.
We're born and raised in an area called Deepdale. It was just what you would, what you would know as a normal brotherly growing-up relationship.
John Joe was my younger brother.
I used to read him storybooks, we'd have baths together. Everything was normal, everything was fine, until he hit that age where things that can pollute someone's mind, sadly, got a hold of him, social media, drugs, alcohol, and that's when everything went wrong.
Preston is like every other town in the country. It's a nice place to live. I work there, but there's a gang problem. It's like I call it organised crime gangs, the disorganised crime gangs. The young adults, males, thinks it's clever to carry knives and wander around protecting what they see as their area, getting some money through drugs. Often assaults happen on a tit-for-tat basis.
I knew John Joe wasn't dealing heroin and crack and stuff like that. I knew he smoked weed, but once they enter that, they then become that culture.
When you looked at John Joe's life, was there anything in there that gave you an indication of the motive as to why he might be murdered?
So there's not just their real life, there's also their online life. So as a family liaison officer now, they are the first line of investigators. You want to know about John Joe? Ask Byron, ask his mum, ask his mates. Dad said to us, John Joe was assaulted by 3 men about a year ago. 2 were convicted, 1 was found not guilty.
The first time I heard the name John Joe Hyton was when he was 17, and I covered a case where he was stabbed. My name's Rachel Smith and I'm a court reporter. He was a young lad, and he'd suffered some very, very severe injuries in that attack, and some people were sent to prison for that attack on him.
Part of his arm was chopped off, and part of his leg was literally wide open. Part of his spine was even fractured from where the machete hit his spine. He was in agony for days and days, and it's the first time I probably saw my mum pray to God, and John Joe survived, and he said to my mum that he's going to change, and he came out of hospital 2 weeks later, and then within a matter of weeks he got his first ever job. He literally changed overnight. You know, I'm really proud of him for that. He became a father, and he turned 18, and it all played a part in the change that was going to be who he was as a man.
And I think culturally in the police, we sometimes treat people as per the mugshot. The real picture of John Joe is him holding his little child. He wasn't a Mr. Big. He's not a bad person. He's a good person, not a violent person, just daft.
I remember having conversations with my mum saying, I feel like this is it. We're on the right path. Everything's going to be fine. Everything's going to be wonderful. And
3 people were involved in that assault, and 1 was found not guilty. He named and blamed that person. He said John Joe has been in fear of him, dodging him for several weeks and avoiding him. Is that the motive? The ferocity of the attack and the wounds are what hit me. This appeared to be targeted. Was it targeted at John Joe, one of his group, or somebody else? I immediately tasked an officer to do research on the person that John Joe's dad named, and it quickly came to notice that that person was in prison. So he physically did not commit this murder himself. So I try and stand back. What's my hypothesis? What's my theory? And what else could it be?
ANPR is a great tool for police to track a car. By putting in a registration number, they can identify the cameras that this car has driven past. But police can also use these cameras to try and identify the cars that have driven past a particular camera. So, for instance, if a crime has taken place at a certain location and they have an idea of a car involved, be it a make, model or colour, the police can search nearby ANPR cameras to identify the registration numbers of cars that fit that description that may have driven past.
The best leads we've got is that witness 710 masked men, partial number plate, Kilo Golf 04 Echo Juliet uniform, the only Vauxhall Vectra. From that, over years we devised an automatic number plate recognition system across Lancashire. And half an hour before the murder, the only car that had those 4 digits that was in the Preston area and was a Vauxhall Vectra was Kilo Golf 04 Echo Juliet uniform, which was previously insured to an Owen Whitesmith. Owen Whitesmith is a member of an opposing sort of gang or set of lads. I've got officers doing research on Whitesmith, but then something else unusual occurs. A sergeant approached me at the cordon. A sergeant who had helped previously is with a young probationer constable. And he told me the story that the previous night, the Friday night, they'd attended the address, which is Owen Whitesmith's mum's address. Owen's mum had been having a drink with a friend of hers. There was a knock on the door and that friend of hers opened the door. Without speaking, a young white male drew his headbutt back and headbutted this lady. She didn't recognise the offender, but she thought, a lad at the gate about 5 yards away. That lad she describes as black or of mixed race, a shaven head, and she believed and named him as a person who is one of John Joe's best friends. And my first reaction was this excessive violence can't be down to such a common assault. But then the more you look at gang culture, if somebody comes on your turf, somebody assaults you at your mum's house, at your house, you want to be a criminal of any standing, you've got to take revenge and it's got to be immediate. Otherwise, you've lost your area. That added the intelligence and evidence I've got against Owen Whitesmith. At that moment, I decided Owen Whitesmith needs arresting on suspicion of the murder of John Joe Hyton. The Vauxhall Vectra pinged only 3 months before, pinged half an hour before, and it's not pinged since. If this is right, they've used a car that's linked to one of them. They didn't put it on false plates. They're amateurs. It's got to be parked in Preston. So we formed a ring of steel, which we thought was impenetrable. We had traffic officers on north, south, east and west of Preston. And we let it be known this is a key vehicle in a murder inquiry. This has to be stopped.
What else is going on at this time?
I need to get to Owen Whitesmith quickly. Otherwise, I felt, he'd be getting rid of knives, he'd be burning clothes, he'd be bleaching himself, and he'd be working out alibis. We've got to take action now. I want him arrested, though, in the next hour. Officers went to the address, forced the door, and upstairs, in bed, was Owen Whitesmith. In his bedroom, they found documentation referring to the Vauxhall Vectra Kilo Golf 04 Echo Juliet uniform. The police searched, but the Vauxhall Vectra was not in the vicinity of Owen Whitesmith's house. It must be elsewhere in Preston. The only thing Owen Whitesmith has said was, I sold that vehicle 3 weeks ago to a man in a pub. And he did not want to be associated with that car. So the officer decided to seize the bedding there and then. In that bedding, she found a broken up phone, and under the pillow, she found the SIM card to that phone. The acting sergeant there, she said, when I found that SIM card, he was handcuffed on the end of the bed and his head slumped. His whole body slumped. That's really significant. The other major piece of evidence we found in that house was in the shower and the sink, there was blood. That blood was sent off as a priority. Every member of that inquiry believed and hoped that was John Joe's blood, because that would be damning. John Joe has never been in Owen Whitesmith's house, to our knowledge. Difficult to explain.
Phone evidence is central to nearly all murder investigations today. And that's because virtually all of us have phones. But as well as providing good evidence, it also creates an awful lot of work, particularly in cases where there are multiple defendants. Because if they haven't got years to look at this, they've only often got hours, days, or weeks. So as good as this evidence is, it definitely also can be a problem for investigators. Very quickly at this crime scene, you're starting to put together information that's pointing towards Owen Whitesmith. So you're going to be really keen at this stage to know what is on that phone, aren't you?
Straight away, that phone's my priority. We turn out a digital investigation officer, and within hours he's saying there's gold dust on this phone.
What evidence were you getting from the phones that you managed to seize and download?
Evidence of phone connections and evidence of text messaging. It names individuals. The text messaging showed a clear message. It shows Owen Whitesmith getting out of bed 8 o'clock in the morning, and he's furious. He's furious at the headbutt. And it names Owen Whitesmith as getting a team together because of the headbutt the night before. They mention a lad called Aaron. He's Aaron or Scottish, who we quickly identify as Aaron Graham.
There was a lot of messages on the phone to other people whipping up anger, really, and getting a gang together to go out and commit this crime. John Joe had nothing to do with the attack at Owen Whitesmith's house. He was somewhere completely different, a few miles away.
The other significant factor was officers had made inquiries. They had gone round to a flat where John Joe, his mate, sort of kept together. They came to the upstairs window, and the friend of John Joe's had dreadlocks, so it could not have been him. He wouldn't blame John Joe specifically, but he would blame members of John Joe's group. As such, was John Joe just unlucky? Is it him they came across? He then gets hold of Aaron Graham. The minute he gets hold of Aaron Graham, it is Graham that is egging on the violence. It's Graham that the text messages say, are we back into the fullest? Who've we got? Ellsbro and big weapons. Right, pick me up, bro. It's all in ridiculous pseudo-gang speak. So my main hypothesis was that Owen Whitesmith instigated this murder, perhaps linked to the headbutt the night before. Aaron Graham became the main violent protagonist. Perhaps it was him who nodded to the key witness behind and had that within him to be so disciplined. Owen Whitesmith later that day is interviewed. He makes no comment to every single question he is ever asked and gives no explanation as to his whereabouts.
So before anything like an interview would take place, he would be examined, wouldn't he, by a doctor, and it would be important to establish what injuries he would have on him.
Yeah, I believe Owen Whitesmith has been involved in this murder. I believe he's been in very close proximity to the victim, John Joe Hyton. Owen Whitesmith appeared to have no injuries and had not bled. That filled me with even more hope that that blood in the sink and the shower is John Joe's blood because it has not come from Owen Whitesmith. So what we did then is I decided to pay a premium, moves it to number 1 in the queue, and you can turn around the decision within hours. So we did that, and we sent it by officer straight to the laboratory, straight under the scientist, and got it examined that day. On the Monday, I got the information that blood was not John Joe Hyton's. It ended up being a sibling who lived in that house who had a nosebleed 2 nights before. Every one of us believed that would come back as John Joe Hyton's blood, and it didn't. That was a crushing blow to the inquiry. So it was a complete red herring. But you've got to keep going. You've got to be relentless. You've got to overcome problems and difficulties. The clock's ticking.
When police are seeking CCTV within a murder investigation, it can go way beyond where a murder has occurred. Where did the suspect go? Have we got footage of those locations? So a murder investigation, CCTV, can have huge parameters, which creates an awful lot of work with all this footage having to be viewed at some point. In any modern-day murder investigation, CCTV plays a huge central role to it. And one of your responsibilities as a senior investigating officer is to set certain strategies. So having set these CCTV parameters and directed your officers, what sort of evidence were they getting back from the CCTV?
What it showed around the scene at the time was very grainy CCTV, because some of the CCTV is very old, and it showed 2 cars circling round as if looking for their prey. And there'd be one in front of another, then change round, but it was for quite some time.
On the night of the murder, my mum actually saw the suspects before the murder.
These people lived around the area that I lived. And my mum rang me and said, I've just seen a group of lads run past my house. They've all got balaclavas on and stuff like that. And my mum actually saw the people who killed her son jump in the 2 cars, and they didn't even know my mum sat there.
With a growing understanding of what had happened. My biggest frustration, potentially, was we haven't found that car. Pretty convinced Kilo Golf 04 Echo Juliet uniform is the car. We felt it was going to be set on fire, or perhaps is there a scrap dealer or somebody that would immediately destroy a vehicle. If this vehicle pings and moves, it is an absolute #1 priority vehicle to be stopped. The vehicle then pings on the far side of Blackburn, a neighbouring town. It was in company with a Saxo, another car, 1 second behind and 1 second ahead. From the pictures, you could see there's probably single people in the car, probably males, but you couldn't identify them. We stopped the vehicle, but it was the wrong vehicle, so we lost it.
The Vauxhall Vectra had escaped for now, but we now knew there was another car connected to it, the Citroen Saxo.
So this is the Monday afternoon, 2 days after the murder. So we then circulated the Saxo as missing. The next day, on the Monday, the Saxo was involved in a pursuit, highly dangerous. This pursuit was manic, wrong way up streets, 80 miles an hour, and eventually, I've never heard it before, the control room inspector said, please contact authorised. So they professionally boxed in the car, stopped it, and got it on the side of the road. Driving that car was Craig Walton. He's also nicknamed Potter, which becomes significant in some of the text messages. He was very compliant. In the passenger seat was this Aaron Graham, nicknamed Scottish.
The text messages indicated that Craig Walton, also nicknamed Potter, was potentially the driver of the vehicle on the night of the murder.
Aaron Graham never stopped trying to bite, punch, kick, spit. So I believe he was the strange lad that got in the rear passenger side of that and tried to intimidate the witnesses. In that vehicle was also found some phones, some documents, and other things that were quite significant. And the phones gave us further opportunity to read them and fill that picture.
We later arrested another of the suspects, believed to be connected to the Vectra, a lad called Stephen Walton. He was arrested at a house that he was sleeping at.
They are all making no comment. but we're building evidence. We're getting further intelligence and intelligence about weapons in that Vectra. Allegedly, Stephen Walton had an axe, but with no major axe injuries. Owen Whitesmith had the samurai sword, which broke at the scene. We've not recovered the hilt or the handle. Craig Walton drove that car and probably never got out the vehicle. Might have been a fifth person in that car we haven't identified yet. But the main protagonist was Aaron Graham. He had knives, and it's him that fatally slashed John Joe Hyton. Over the next few days and weeks, the name Joshua Bohr came into the inquiry. He'd initially gave an alibi, which was strongly supported by his family. About the other car, we start making progress. There's talk of some Asian lads in the other car. There was a people carrier. The name Patel keeps cropping up. Dal crops up for intelligence. And the detective inspector that manages the intelligence in Preston, and he's confident he'll get more details later. Drugs world, gang world, it's very leaky. So at this point, we went public on the Vectra murder vehicle. I should have done it earlier in hindsight. Who finds the car? Of course, it's dog walkers. The car is burnt out on Sunnyhurst Woods near Blackburn. Forensic officers go and examine that scene, and we have a bit of luck. The fire burnt, but ran out of oxygen and died away. Pictures show that in the front driver's seat well, where your feet go, there was litter. When you pull back that litter, there was the clasp of a samurai sword. Examine that for DNA, and on the back of that clasp, where your hand would go, was Owen Whitesmith's DNA. A chance of billions to one that it could be anybody else.
So despite the disappointment of the blood within Owen Whitesmith's house not coming back to John Joe, you still had good enough evidence against him to go to the Crown Prosecution Service in order to get a charge. Is that fair to say?
The evidence against Owen Whitesmith, I felt, was still overwhelming. They were satisfied the threshold test has been made, they were satisfied it was in the public interest, and the necessity test was passed, and they authorised the charge of Owen Whitesmith. And subsequently, they authorised the charging of several other people along the same process.
Aaron Graham, Craig Walton and Stephen Walton were all charged with the murder of John Joe Hyton.
Also, what comes significant later is there's a Sprite pop bottle in the back of the car.
DNA was recovered from the lip of the Sprite bottle. It was later tested and identified as belonging to a Joshua Bohr.
Now, there's a big difference between having your DNA in a pop bottle and the clasp of a samurai sword. And this vehicle was previously owned by Leon Tunstall, who's Joshua Bohr's brother. So we can easily explain why his DNA is on a pop bottle.
We now needed to take a closer look at Joshua Bohr.
And initially, his family gave an alibi that he was fishing at an organised sort of fishing camp. And the DC kept going on. It almost became painful. This isn't right, boss. This isn't right. It's too orchestrated. And then you've got his DNA in this pop bottle. What they then did, that's Sprite bottle, you don't know where every bottle is, but the manufacturer of that knows where every pallet load is. And halfway through June, they knew that that pallet load was in a distribution centre in Swindon. Remember the murder vehicle pinged 3 weeks before? It was caught on a police camera. When they went back to that scene, there were some cars for sale on some rough ground. And a phone number in those cars referred to Liam Tunstall. So that's where Liam Tunstall sold some cars. And this must have been one of those to sell. They also noticed it was on a bus route. So they downloaded the bus CCTV every day. Cars there, cars there. 21st, cars there. 22nd, cars there. 23rd of August, the car's there. 8 o'clock at night, the car's there. 9:30, the car's there. 10:30, the car's missing. So we argued that those inquiries puts that pop bottle in the back of that car after 9:30 on the night of the murder. That got Joshua Bohr charged with murder. That's technology.
No, but it's not just technology. That's thinking out of the box. And
Yeah.
you had that technology could have just been sat there and nobody having looked at it. So that's very good police work, isn't it?
That's a detective challenging the narrative. An experienced detective saying, boss, this isn't right.
We now had all the occupants we believed had been in the Vectra on the night of the murder. However, we still need to find and trace the second car and its occupants.
Major inquiries are not solved, as on the telly, by a couple of senior officers thinking about it over a drink in the pub. Complex inquiries are solved by a highly motivated team of professionals, all pulling together, all challenging the narrative and not just accepting what one person says as facts, pulling it apart and doing their job. If you remember, the first witness said the first vehicle around he thought was a Renault Scenic. Very experienced civilian CCTV viewer takes these images to the Renault garage and they're adamant it's not a Renault. It is not a Renault Scenic. Suggest you go to the Ford or the Vauxhall garage. She went to Vauxhall. That vehicle is definitely a Vauxhall Mariva. That led to ANPR inquiries. Preston, night of the murder, Vauxhall Mariva. There was only one vehicle that jumped out. That vehicle was owned by Minhaj Musa.
So this is now giving you a new line of inquiry, a new suspect to look at.
At this stage, intelligence had led to the arrest of 2 low-level cannabis dealers, thought to have been in the people carrier on the night of the murder. One called Zahid Patel and the other Mohammed Sabadal, but so far they were staying quiet.
We've got Patel and Dal in the custody at this stage, and they're not saying anything. Minhaj Musa lives in the Deepdale area. I was contacted by the detective inspector in charge of the covert team, who said, Ed, I found this vehicle, and can we surveil it? I said, all right, surveil it. And he did. Every other case in 30 years I've been involved in, when we've done anything like this, nothing happens, or it happens days later. 20 minutes later, I kid you not, Minhaj Musa walks up to that vehicle. He looks under the vehicle. He looks around. He walks up and down the street looking at other people. He then leans into the boot of that vehicle and opens the boot. It is at that point that surveillance officers get hold of him and arrest him on suspicion of murder. He's reaching inside that boot, and in that boot is a golf club head cover that exactly matches the Dunlop golf club head that was broken and left at the scene of the attack 1 metre from where John Joe's body lay. And the key of that is that showed Musa's guilty knowledge. It's not an offence to get the head of a golf club cover out your car, but you don't do that anti-surveillance and that careful looking around if you didn't have guilty knowledge. Musa said, I used to drive Patel round to sell our cannabis. I used to get a few quid for driving him round. I am completely non-violent person, but the story we're getting is that's not down to the headbutt. It's down to them getting taxed by John Joe's friends, namely their drugs, cannabis, and money taken off them continually. So did these two groups come together, Owen Whitesmith and Patel, one because of being taxed, one because of the headbutt? Those admissions made Patel speak and say I was there and had the golf club, and Dal speak and say I was there and had a stick. But both of them saying they weren't part of any joint enterprise.
We also looked at calls made between Patel and Whitesmith on the night of the murder.
Patel phones Owen Whitesmith and for 24 seconds, and less than 2 minutes later, the police are rung about the murder. So you've got to think why that is. The people carrier was the first car there. They were directing the Vectra into where they found John Joe Hyten.
It wasn't unusual for Patel and Whitesmith to contact each other occasionally about drugs, but contacting each other on the night of the murder, so close to the murder, made it stand out as suspicious.
All three were charged with murder under joint enterprise.
In some incidents, particularly mass violence, it can be really difficult to differentiate between who did what. It's not always easy to say who was the stabber, who did this, who did that. And this is where the principle of joint enterprise is used.
It was obvious from almost day one that this was going to be prosecuted under joint enterprise. This case is exactly what joint enterprise is there for.
The trial took place at Preston Crown Court in the spring of 2015. It was a 13-week-long trial with lots and lots of witnesses.
With 82 witnesses to get to court and prepare properly, if you don't look after your witnesses, the defendants and their family, their associates will. About a third of them did not want to go to court particularly. A third to half of them live in the same communities as the victims and offenders, same way of life. So they need supporting. They're not on trial. You're going to have 8 people charged with murder and 3 with assisting murder, 11 barristers, 11 solicitors. They're going to have time at trial to try and criticise every angle of this case. So we've got to be watertight.
When the defendants came into court, it was quite shocking how young they were. There were times they had no respect for the court. They were often reprimanded for their behaviour, laughing amongst themselves at the start. These guys had no respect for anyone. John Joe's mum sat there every day. I don't know how she did that, to listen to that evidence.
In a murder investigation, it's really important to understand how a person died. At the post-mortem that would have been carried out by a forensic pathologist, what was that telling you?
It tells us that John Joe suffered many injuries. The cause of death was this wound across here that broke the artery in the neck, and he bled to death quickly from that.
The injuries were that bad, they are classed as decapitation. He died within about 45 seconds, but 45 seconds of dying, I guarantee it felt like 4 weeks.
I was satisfied that we put before a jury all 8 people that were present. I was also satisfied it's up to a jury to decide if, under joint enterprise, all those 8 people are guilty. Not me, not the CPS. We get them there with the evidence. The key thing when it came to court was not one piece of the technology undermined the case, because it was true. Every single person there, eventually at court, agreed that phone was mine. The reason they did that was not through an altruistic purpose. It was because if they lied about their phone, the jury would see through them and say, you're lying. If you're lying about that, what else are you lying about? Owen Whitesmith claimed to be present at the scene. He claimed not to have a samurai sword, and he claimed that in a saloon car, a Vectra, he didn't see an axe, knives, samurai sword, or anything else that could harm John Joe Hyten. It was just nonsense. It was completely unbelievable. He gave no explanation for the DNA on the samurai sword clasp and just denied any knowledge of that sword or having it at the scene. Aaron Graham then went in the box. He reiterated almost the same story as Owen Whitesmith. All those in the Vectra pretty much gave the same story. I was there, I didn't see the weapons on the way, I didn't know what was going to happen, I wasn't part of any joint enterprise. Then the most amazing day I've ever had in court, Joshua Bohr told all.
He was sticking to his story, and he stuck to his story, and he stuck to his story, and he was challenged. And under cross-examination, the barrister said to him, don't you think it's time you started telling the truth? And at that point, he admitted that he'd been at the scene of the murder.
The first thing he said was, I was in the Vectra and Craig Walton was driving. The jury turned to look at Craig Walton in the witness box, who'd just gone in and said he wasn't present, and he held his head in his hands and swore. It was electric. Bohr then went on to say, I was in the middle at the back. Next to me on my left was Aaron Graham. He had knives. After the incident, he's waving these knives about that are dropping with blood and was making jokes and laughing about killing John Joe. On his right was Stephen Walton, he said, who had an axe. He says then, I didn't see any of these weapons going there. I don't know the lads in the other car, and I'm not part of any joint enterprise. Aaron Graham shouts, 5 of us go to a knife fight, and 1 doesn't take a knife. That makes sense, because Joshua Bohr said he didn't have a knife, he didn't see the weapons, I wasn't part of a joint enterprise.
From that point, they turned on each other.
And an actual fight broke out in the court where they was trying to harm each other because they was all grassing on each other.
Patel, Dow and Musa all went in the box, all stuck to their original stories. Patel, I had a golf club, I didn't go anywhere near John Joe, couldn't really explain why the golf club was right at the scene of the attack. Dow, I had a stick and I threw a brick. Musa, I drove the car there, I am not a violent person, I had no idea who was in the other car, really hit me later. If John Joe hadn't finished his pint, he'd have got home. He'd have simply wandered home a bit earlier and they would never come across him.
So eventually you reach a stage where the jury go out. Describe to me how you are feeling at this stage when you start to hear that verdicts are coming back.
It was an emotionally draining process for absolutely everybody involved. The tension was palpable. The jury went out on Monday, I think. Thursday afternoon, we were called back in. jury came back and they found Owen Whitesmith, Aaron Graham, Craig Walton and Stephen Walton guilty of the murder of John Joe Hyton. They then came back on a decision on Patel, guilty of murder, on the fact that he had wielded that golf club. Then the jury was allowed to go to a majority and straight away came back guilty of Joshua Bohr. Once Joshua Bohr was found guilty of murder, the three other people standing trial were found guilty of assisting him. That just left Dal and Musa. So Dal and Musa plead guilty to conspiring to cause grievous bodily harm to John Joe Hyton, and they're later sentenced. But I think that result was fair. I think any doubt over joint enterprise with them two, I see a difference with Patel, he used the golf club right at the scene of the attack. The victim impact statement from Mrs. Hyton and Mr. Hyton was read out, and Mrs. Hyton was read out by a female detective, which was very emotive and emotional. The judge said, I want every defendant in that dock, come what may. They need to listen to the harm they've done. Sentencing reflected the severity of the case. The six found guilty of murder were sentenced to life, but then you put a tariff on them. These are some of the longest tariffs other than a whole life sentence that we've ever experienced. It ranged from 20 years for Patel to 29 years for Aaron Graham. Aaron Graham was a strange individual. I think would always gone on to hurt people. All the others are, perhaps decentish people that made bad choices, perhaps didn't have the right guidance from some people and got in amongst their mates and got into drug dealing and gang culture. But my sympathy and feelings go entirely to the Hyton family.
This case really stayed with me. For any mother to lose a son, or for any brother to lose a brother, and absolutely for any child to lose their dad in such a senseless and violent way, you'd have to have a heart of stone for that not to stay with you.
John Joe's funeral was unbelievable. Now that I can look back and, in hindsight and look at the positive, it was unbelievable. There was best part of 600 people there. I remember the vicar even saying that he'd never seen so many people at a funeral. My mum was there putting a brave face on, and as soon as that hearse came around the corner and it said son, brother, dad, oh, the whole street broke down. It was brutal. I was honoured. I was so honoured to carry my own brother's coffin, and I was honoured to give a speech that took me a good few weeks to write. And that was my first ever experience of actually using words for power.
I've linked up with Byron now. I work in education, and he's fantastic at trying to dissuade young people from carrying knives. The answer lies in what Byron says, trying to get the culture of young people away from knife crime.
Tell me your feelings on the case and how it affected you and how you remember it.
I think I've feelings then, feelings now. Then, I was immensely proud. And I thought we pulled off something quite phenomenal. We didn't give anywhere to go. Now I work in education. I'm proud to have been a cop, but it seems a long time ago. Proud that I was involved in this, and this was the fulcrum of everything that I trained for and learnt in the police. But I look back and I think the public should understand the drain that it is on officers and police staff day in, day out over decades. It is relentless.
Eddie, from what I've listened here, I think you should be proud. I've dealt with an awful lot of murders and I've seen best practice. I can't think of many cases where I've seen such good practice across the whole of the investigation. Proving a case against 8 defendants that were wearing balaclavas where you didn't know who did what. To get the result you did, I think personally, is an amazing achievement and is testament to the work that you and your team put into it. So from me, on behalf of John Joe, who you were doing that for, and John Joe's family, thank you for you and your team for that professionalism and that work that you put in. To me, it's just truly amazing.
As an experienced murder investigator myself, when I was sat down and talking with Eddie, I've got to be honest, I was so impressed with the work they did. They went above and beyond in terms of proving a case and making it as simple as possible for people to understand. The work they did to get a conviction for those that murdered John Joe was amazing. To get the justice that he deserved and for John Joe's family was honestly some of the best police work that I have witnessed from afar. A sad aspect to this case is that John Joe realised that he had to change his lifestyle and try and get himself out of that cycle of violence. The fact that he tried to get himself out of this life and ultimately it was his connections to it that led to his murder, to me just adds to the complete tragicness of this case.